A park ranger stands in a meadow.
Good morning. Welcome to Yosemite Valley. My name is Shelton Johnson. When most Americans think of African Americans and national park history, they usually think of notable figures such as Frederick Douglass or Booker T. Washington, or most recently, Harriet Tubman. But they don't normally think of wild places like Yosemite. They think of urban environments, they think of rural environments, but not a wilderness. And Yosemite is very much a wilderness. But Yosemite also houses some great stories involving African Americans. During the gold rush, there were African Americans in the foothills of the Sierra who were panning for golds, trying to strike it rich just like everyone else, but they had other things to purchase, such as their own freedom, potentially. You have African Americans serving here as stage drivers, and in particular, I'm thinking of George Monroe, who worked for the Washburn brothers and actually drove in different presidents into Yosemite National Park. And then during the New Deal, under Franklin Roosevelt, there were African Americans who worked for the Civilian Conservation Corps right here in Yosemite Valley, repairing and building infrastructure in Yosemite. But the most important story, not that those other stories aren't important, but the most important would involve the Buffalo Soldiers. These were African American cavalry and infantry troops who served as some of the first park rangers right here in Yosemite as well as Sequoia National Park. Here in Yosemite, they built trails. They were responsible for building the first nature trail or first museum in the national park system on the South Fork of the Merced River in the area known as Wawona. And it was just something pretty simple in design. It was just a trail along the South Fork of the Merced with plants labeled in both English and Latin, but it's considered today to be the first museum in the national park system. And then in Sequoia National Park in 1903, the Buffalo Soldiers built the first usable wagon road into Sequoia's giant forest, the most famous grove of giant sequoia in the world. So with those contributions, you think they would have been remembered, but they were forgotten. And so for quite a few years now, myself and my predecessors have brought that story back. That story is now known nationwide and even around the world to some degree. And the key thing that I always try to communicate is that their presence allowed for a greater window to be open for African Americans and other communities of color to see themselves reflected in that window and to look into that history and see themselves present. And that's a very powerful thing if you grow up in an urban environment, an inner city, and national parks are, to you, someplace that does not have your fingerprint. Your psyche is not part of that landscape. So when you know these stories, they lend themselves to you feeling more rooted in places that you thought were foreign. And that's a very powerful thing. And so when I'm here in Yosemite, I'm always thinking about my predecessors, the Buffalo Soldiers, who built those trails, who patrolled the high country, who made certain that the poaching was limited, who made certain that people were safe, who basically created a presence of law and order in a lawless West. That's a very powerful thing and a very powerful contribution to our national parks and to American history. So if you get to Yosemite, you get to Sequoia, ask about the Buffalo Soldiers, ask about some of the first park rangers, and then when you see a ranger and he or she is wearing a hat like this, that's where this hat came from. It came from the campaign hat that was worn by the cavalry troops who were here, the cavalry hat that was worn by the Buffalo Soldiers.
Ranger Johnson wears a tan-colored, wide-brimmed felt campaign hat.